and we have to get started today. We had a few people wander in, but I'm going to have Maddie come up and introduce our
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Becky and I'm a second-year student in the Social Psych PhD program here at Michigan. And today I'm very excited to introduce to you our next speaker in the Political Polarization series, Dr. Yanna Krupnikov. She's the professor of Communications and Media at the University of Michigan. Dr. Krupnikov received her PhD in Political Science from the University of Michigan in 2009, before working at Stony Brook University, where she was a full professor in 2021. And in January of this year, Dr. Krupnikov returned back here to the University of Michigan as a professor of communications and media. Broadly, her work focuses on political communication, in particular attention to news, political expression, and social interactions. Her work has been featured in top-tier journals such as the American Political Science Review and American Journal of Political Science. It has also been featured in popular press outlets such as the New York Times and the Washington Post. And her work has received awards from the American Political Science Association and been funded by the National Science Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Yanna Krupnikov as she presents her work, Unfriending, Polarization and Political Disagreement in Social Networks.
Okay. So I'm going to use this mic as I'm supposed to. So thank you so much. I'm so excited to present this. This is the first time we've put all of this together. We've been running experiments and studies for a bit. And this is work with my two amazing co-authors, Liz Connors and Sam Clark. And so the question that we're kind of starting with, what we're going to talk about is, why do people end relationships over politics? And I think the main question that I want to sort of pose, were these good relationships to begin with? Kind of when we see them end. So there is really no shortage of these types of stories in the news. This has become kind of a key topic, which is that people are ending relationships basically over politics. These are recently, so 2020, 2022, the New York Times one, but these have been around for a while. As the Washington Post tells us, this is from more than 8 years ago. So this is somebody ending a relationship because they voted for Romney. And this is the type of story that is now in the UK as well, basically asking, essentially, whether Brexit is destroying relationships, and presumably not just because people are being deported. So the question really is, right, are these relationships ending? This type of news coverage has pretty much the same narrative. There is some relationship that was perfect. It was great. Everyone kind of loved each other. Then one day, somebody woke up, turned on the news, or voted for a candidate. And to quote Taylor Swift, now we've got problems. So, right, this is the story that these articles suggest. Couple of things that I'm going to suggest here is that this narrative puts politics front and center. Right? If there had never been an election, if there had never been news, these are people who would still keep talking. However, right, when you read these stories and you hear people talk about these relationships, you might ask yourself, are these actually good relationships? Were they sort of satisfying, kind of strong, positive relationships in people's lives? And so this is kind of where we're going to step in and look at. So I think it's important to contextualize what is it that's happening in this news narrative. So are these people basically vox populi, so the voice of a greater public? Most of these news articles rely on anecdotes, long-form interviews, long-form stories of people who have ended relationships. There are some statistical data here to tell you how prevalent this type of unfriending is. In one of the more recent stories, so this New York Times piece that politics has changed relationships, the New York Times tells you that 19% of people in a survey they conducted had disagreements with family or friends over political issues, and that these disagreements had hurt relationships. Another figure that these type of articles often cite is a 42%. That comes from Pew. And this is the number of people who told Pew that they stopped talking to someone else about politics. Now, in theory, you could stop talking to somebody about politics and yet still continue a relationship, but that is a common figure cited here. When it comes to actually ending a relationship, the figure that people have often given is something like 15%, which is you've literally stopped being friends with somebody. And this is the 2021 Ipsos figure is pretty much on par with the 2017 figure of 16.4%. The American National Election Study, so another survey, puts it closer to about 13% of people saying that disagreements have hurt their relationships with family. Though just about half of that said these disagreements have hurt their relationships a great deal. Now, a lot of the unfriending is happening on social media. About 24% said that they have unfriended somebody on social media, so rather than in person, or have unfollowed somebody because of political posts. Most of these unfriendings have been of people that they have described as acquaintances and strangers. And for context, about 45% of people have unfriended an ex. So people are unfriending people on politics, about politics on social media, more unfriending exes. So I think it's really important to contextualize these patterns. So what do these statistics mean? So first of all, I think we really need to think about the sourcing of these articles. If we're going to think about how prevalent ending these relationships are, how many people are actually ending relationships over politics, I think it's important to think about how these people end up in news articles. This is how, for example, the New York Times solicited sources of people who had ended relationships in more recent stories. So they basically they asked readers to basically self-report their stories of ending relationships, and they contacted some of their readers. This is how NPR solicited stories of relationships friending. They went to Facebook and said, have you found people annoying on Facebook basically due to politics? Have you unfriended somebody? Have you ended social media use? So a lot of these stories are about sourcing. The other thing to think about of people unfriending or ending relationships, especially on social media due to politics, is that actually we now know a lot of people that before social media we really should have lost touch with. Right? We know a lot of people about whom we should know like basically nothing. This seafood tower represents politics. Why? This is a Facebook post from somebody that my co-author Liz Connors knew a decade ago from a part-time summer job. In any other kind of environment, aside from social media, Liz would know absolutely nothing about this person. But now Liz knows on the regular, like everything this lady has for dinner. But it's more than just that, right? Liz knows all about this person's politics when she otherwise wouldn't. And what Jamie Settle suggests in her book Frenemies is really that we are now able to see so much more about people's political ideas than we really actually ever did before, or potentially than we ever should. What this means is that there are just a lot of people for us to unfriend. Looking at research by Robert Bond and Jamie Settle on kind of social networks, there are people we interact with in social media, and then there's this whole other circle of people whose posts we see, but with whom we rarely interact. So is that who's being unfriended? And maybe that's okay, right? Maybe Liz shouldn't know that much about seafood tower lake. So kind of thinking about kind of who we are unfriending, how often we're engaging in this type of unfriending, I think is really important. And so what we're going to try to do here is move beyond this question of frequency, beyond thinking about, well, how often are people unfriending? Is everyone unfriending? Is politics now front and center? And this is how we're ending relationships. And sort of think about another set of questions. I think the first question that's really important here is actually who is most likely to end a relationship. So who is saying in surveys they have ended relationships due to politics? And most of the research here suggests that it's people who are interested in politics. And that makes sense. If you're really interested in something, and somebody kind of completely disagrees with you, you're going to be more sensitive to that. So Letitia Bodie shows that most of the unfriending people who report in 2016 they unfriended somebody on politics are people who are really interested in political questions. In a separate part of this project, Liz, Samara, and I included questions on the 2020 congressional election study, asking people on several different scenarios about unfriending and whether they have unfriended people in those types of scenarios. We varied whether this was in-person unfriending or on social media. And we find, just like Bodie, that it really co-occurs with interest. People who are more interested in politics are more likely to unfriend others. But we also find that there is something kind of beyond interest. There's really something about how engaged you're in politics, how important politics is to you. So for example, we asked people whether they, how often they post, sort of originate political conversations on social media. And even among people who are really, really interested in politics, the more you originate political conversations, the more likely you are to say across a variety of scenarios that you had unfriended somebody. For comparison, the extent to which you encounter political posts really didn't matter as long as you were interested. It's really how much you are engaging in politics that really matters. So there's something about political engagement that is important. People for whom politics is important, who talk about politics, are much more likely to unfriend. The other question that's interesting here is, what is really the context of unfriending? So where are people unfriending? Are they leaving family dinners? Are they leaving social gatherings? Or are they basically just clicking a button on social media and basically making sure they never see anything another person posts again? And in our data, we find that it is much more likely on social media. People were much more likely to unfriend somebody over political differences in a social media environment, which again makes sense. It's much easier to click a button and do so anonymously than to tell somebody like, I hate you, we're never going to talk to each other again. But underlying, I think, these questions about unfriending and underlying these questions about frequency and underlying all of these stories, this narrative that everything was great and then politics came along and now we're not friends anymore, is this question of basically how important politics is in a relationship. Is politics really enough to end a relationship that is otherwise important and good and positive in your life? And so this is the question that we're going to pose here, which is, how much does politics matter? So when we return kind of to this idea of politics in a relationship, what we're really looking at is, when do we perceive politics as the deal breaker? So what is actually happening in your day-to-day interactions with this person that lead politics to be the breaking point in a relationship? And how much politics do we need? Is it enough that somebody votes for a different candidate? Do they have to make some sort of comment that would lead to an unfriending? Essentially, how front and center are we going to put politics in a relationship? And at what point are we actually going to end a relationship due to politics? So if we think about this narrative, right, that everything's great, then an election happens, and now there's a problem. The argument here is that because politics is going to loom larger than anything that has happened in a relationship. And so the question we're going to ask basically is, well, does it? Does politics loom larger in a relationship? Or is the possibility that politics is looming this large in a relationship a sign that potentially it wasn't that great of a relationship to begin with? So this is where we're going to start. We're going to start with four, I think, connected ideas about where politics fits into our relationships. The first idea is that a ton of research suggests that partisan differences, partisan divides actually can spill over into non-political content. In fact, as I find with my co-authors, Jamie Druckman, Matt Lewandowski, Sam Clark, and John Ryan, there's actually now more research on the fact that polarization affects non-political outcomes than the fact that it affects any political outcomes. This idea then that politics affects our non-political context would suggest then that politics should spill over in our social lives, leading to these unfriendings, leading to creating kind of these effects. So politics, in theory, is extraordinarily important. And yet, people really don't like talking about it. There's research to suggest that people generally don't like talking about politics. In my work with Sam Clark and John Ryan, we show that people actually don't really want to be around somebody of their own party who constantly talk about politics. And same in the Druckman et al. Piece. So it's kind of puzzling. Politics is super important, and yet lots of people never ever want to talk about politics. So what is happening to bring politics to the forefront in relationships? People are most comfortable disagreeing with their strong ties. So in theory, people are most comfortable bringing up the fact that they disagree when they know that the person isn't going to punish them for it. And work by Morey, Evelyn, and Hutchins, they show that even though most of our relationships are with people who are just like us politically, when we do feel comfortable disagreeing, it is with somebody with whom we have a closer connection, somebody who we trust isn't necessarily going to walk away when we share a disagreement. But I think the other kind of critical idea here is that most of our political conversations, most of our relationships aren't actually starting with politics. As Minozzi and co-authors show, and Chip Evelyn's work and David Lazar, politics is often a totally incidental byproduct of other types of conversations. In kind of these extended networks on a college campus, Minozzi and co-authors show that people start out talking about literally anything else. And then politics comes up almost incidentally. It looks like we have chosen our friends because they have the same politics as us. But oftentimes, Minozzi and co-authors suggest, that's actually just an accident because partisanship correlates with other identities. We're choosing our friends and conversation partners for a million other reasons. Politics of being last, but because politics correlates with so many identities, it looks like we have chosen into sort of similar political groups. So what that means is that when we have kind of especially close friendship relationships, these are people who we like for reasons that have literally nothing to do with politics. We wanted to talk to them for other reasons. So that's the case. Can politics end relationships? Or more likely, when would politics end relationships? We suggest that there is going to be a fifth idea at hand, and that's that the quality of the relationship is going to matter. It's going to, your previous interactions with this person are going to matter in terms of how central politics is going to be in your relationship. And just to put it as simply as I possibly can, politics is more likely to end your relationship with the person who you did not really like in the first place. So what do I mean by this? There is a lot of research suggesting that we are most likely to unfriend weak ties. In other words, we're most likely to unfriend people who aren't really giving us a lot of emotional support, on whom we don't depend, who aren't in our kind of close network on friends. So if Liz, my co-author, is going to unfriend somebody on Facebook, and I don't know if she is, it would probably be Seafood Lady. Right? It wouldn't be somebody that she actually interacts. I don't know anything about Seafood Lady's politics. I just know that seafood tower. So apologies to that person. So the question we're asking is basically kind of different. Within these close ties, you could still have bad relationships. And within weak ties, you could actually have really pleasant interactions. So put politics aside for a second. Before that person voted for a candidate you don't like, before that person posted some story that you hated, how good was this relationship to begin with? How much did you enjoy this person? And potentially more importantly, what is this person actually doing with their politics? Are they voting for a candidate, or are they consistently posting inflammatory information? We can think of it kind of in other ways. Is this somebody who you felt understood by? Is it somebody who understood you? Was this person receptive to your ideas in the past? Is it somebody you felt comfortable with? Did you feel like you got emotional support from them in all of your interactions prior to politics? Was this somebody good? Was this somebody with whom you had similar preferences? In other words, what did this relationship mean to you before politics entered the picture? What we suggest is that how much you liked this person is going to be important. We unfriend people for all sorts of reasons that have nothing to do with politics. But key to our willingness to end a relationship is the quality of that relationship to begin with. So what we suggest here is that politics can look like it's breaking relationships because it is really divisive. These differences are incredibly clear, and they have become a pivotal part of the news cycle. We see these stories about politics ending relationships. But what if it's not about politics? What if it's about the fact that we are willing to shed relationships that aren't really that great? When a person does something publicly that we dislike and something becomes the last straw. So the question that we're going to consider in our studies is, how does politics fit in with this history of enjoyable interactions? Are you going to put politics beyond how much you actually enjoy the person? So we're going to do it with 3 studies. These are not in chronological order, and they're not in chronological order for a very specific reason, which is that this last study is not like the others, but it does belong. But it's going to take quite a different approach to looking at relationships, whereas the first 2 are going to be more similar. So what is going to happen here? There are a bunch of barriers to studying unfriending. First of all, most people are in politically homogenous networks, which means that they don't actually have that many people who they would unfriend for political reasons. They're friends with people who are just like them. We think that this is a modern day problem, but this is Paul Beck writing about the 1988 elections after charting political networks, saying the most striking result, although it is hardly unexpected, is how rarely respondents see themselves in a discordant network. So 1988 election, same as here, people are in networks with those who agree with them. And he's saying this shouldn't be surprising, citing literature from the 1950s and 40s. So most people are in social networks with those that they disagree with those people whom they agree. Most people have never actually unfriended anyone. In our research, about 80% of people have never actually ended a relationship due to politics. What this means is that if we were to recruit a nationally representative sample, by the time we got to people who had ever unfriended anyone and asked them questions, 80% of our sample would be gone. And the other issue is that people really like to construct histories. So if you have ended a relationship, you're going to construct a narrative about that relationship. So you're going to construct a narrative about why that person was bad, why you were potentially really good. And so the result here wouldn't necessarily be indicative of what had actually gone on in a particular environment. So we're going to take a different approach. We are going to ask people about their perceptions of ending relationships under different contexts. In theory, people might not explain why they specifically ended a relationship, but people are really good at judging others. And so as a result, we think that asking people whether somebody else was right to end a specific relationship could really speak to the extent to which they value politics in day-to-day life. So the other thing that we're going to do here is we're going to be really clear that this was it, right? This is not just like clicking the unfollow button. One of the news stories talks about somebody who had unfollowed their sister on Facebook, but still goes to that sister's Facebook feed to see pictures of the sister's kids and still talks to the sister at like all family gatherings like it's all normal. No, here in our studies, people are told like, that's it. These two people are done. They are no longer friends. It's over. And our focus is going to be on non-family relationships. This is going to be somebody ending a relationship with somebody who is not in their family. In our CES data, the survey data, we actually find that people view ending family relationships extraordinarily negatively. So we felt like this was sort of stacking the deck against finding any evidence that politics matters. So it's a non-family relationship. In this study, in our first study, a person has ended a 10-year relationship after it becomes clear that their now former friend had voted for the opposing candidate. In our treatment, the candidate was opposing to Taylor, the unfriender, and the candidate was opposing to the respondent. So for example, if the respondent is a Democrat, they were told that Taylor had unfriended somebody who had voted for Donald Trump. And if the respondent is a Republican, they were told that Taylor had unfriended somebody who voted for Biden. The unfriending is total. It's not just on social media, but you have decided you're never going to speak to this person again, for the case. And it was a two-factor study. First, we tell whether Taylor, the unfriender in this case, had actually enjoyed interacting with the person they unfriended in the past. And then we also randomize how much this unfriended person had actually brought up politics during the election. Did they talk about it a lot? Did they never bring it up? Okay, so the extent to which this person's politics was front and center. And we're going to measure two outcomes. Do you agree in this case with the decision to unfriend? And how favorably do you view the unfriender? So, do you feel good about the person who broke the relationship, or do you not feel that great about it? So I'm going to show you kind of the basic results first. So here, higher values are going to be greater agreement with the decision to unfriend. So that means the higher the bar, the more the respondents are like, yeah, this person should definitely be unfriended, the relationship should definitely be ended. And the lower the bar, the more the people are kind of like, I don't know about this, maybe you shouldn't have done it. And so here we have on the bottom the 4 conditions, which is somebody frequently talked about politics, didn't really have positive interactions, somebody rarely talked about politics, don't really have a history of positive interactions, and then here are the 2 conditions where you have a history of positive interactions. So what do we see here? We basically see that you're most likely to agree that this person should have been unfriended if it's somebody with whom you didn't really have a history of positive interactions who frequently talked about politics. So if this is somebody who you haven't really had that great of a relationship with, who constantly is going on about their politics, you feel good about the unfriending decision. This might not seem sexy. Yeah, you don't like them, they constantly talk about politics, sure, unfriend them. But I think within the media narrative, there would be this expectation that even over here, when it's somebody you really like, people could end relationships due to politics. But I think there's actually something interesting here beyond just the means, right? So these are the means. You're more likely to agree with somebody who frequently talks about politics. I think the distribution of these results for us was also interesting. And this is what the distribution looks like. So over here, if it's somebody who doesn't really talk about politics, somebody who you like, we see a cluster of people who say that they strongly disagree with the decision to unfriend them. But what's interesting about this group, which is the group with the most agreement that this person should have been unfriended, is that the greatest clustering is in the neither category. People don't actually feel all that great about ending a 10-year relationship, even with somebody who constantly talked about politics, whom you might not have liked all that much. And we see sort of the same pattern when we look at favorability. People perceive the person who ended the relationship most favorably when they ended a relationship with somebody that they don't really like all that much. We pre-registered a number of other considerations. We wanted to see how partisanship, affective polarization, the use of social media, and importance of family would affect all of these things. We found no partisan differences, so Democrats and Republicans behave sort of in the same way. They were, the effects looked quite similar. We didn't really find that affective polarization changed the results either. People in the high and low end of affective polarization kind of behave the same way. The one place where we saw somewhat of a difference was on this importance of family and friends variable. People who viewed social relationships as being really, really important were generally in every condition more reticent to say that this person should have been unfriended. But the treatment effect kind of still stuck. Okay, so what do we learn from this exercise? Basically, the history of interactions, frequency of politics led to unfriending, but people weren't all that excited about unfriending generally. But this is kind of a weak experiment. You just voted for another candidate. What if, instead of just saying that they voted for another candidate, the person that you unfriended made a political statement? So what if something kind of more conflictual actually happened? And so this is going to be our next study. This is now YouGov, 1,200 participants. We're going to do the same approach. An individual has unfriended somebody, but this time the unfriending comes after the person basically said, quote, "Your party is destroying America." And so in this particular case, Democrats saw a statement that said Democrats are destroying America. Republican participants saw a treatment where they were told that this person posted that Republicans are destroying America. Here, because we have a lower end, we're going to use only one factor here, which is did you enjoy interacting with this person? And also, I think it would have been kind of a harder case to make that somebody who rarely talks about politics suddenly posted like Democrats are destroying America, Republicans are destroying America. So we focus on this quality of interaction. These are our outcome measures. They are the same. Note that here on the agreement, we have a 1 to 7 scale rather than a 1 to 5, because kind of in the middle of doing these studies, we got feedback that perhaps we didn't give people enough scale points, and this is why we got kind of the patterns that we got. So we're going to do so here. So the figure is going to look kind of quite similar here. Higher values are going to mean greater agreement with the decision to unfriend. And so we find kind of similar results. People are more likely to agree with the unfriending when it's somebody you do not like. People are quite lukewarm on unfriending somebody of 10 years who you like, even when they said their party is destroying America. We can again look at the distribution here. And the distribution is going to be somewhat different. In both of the conditions, people are kind of clustering in this neither category in the sense that they're somewhat ambivalent about the unfriended. And again, we're going to see the same results for the favorability. People are more likely to perceive the unfriender more favorably when they've unfriended somebody that they dislike, even though this person has made a fairly inflammatory statement. We again pre-registered sort of different characteristics, so whether this matters partisan strength or affective polarization changes the results. So I'm going to show you the patterns for affective polarization here. So basically here, these are going to be people at the lowest affective polarization, then ranges getting us to the highest affective polarization on the x-axis. And I'm going to show you two bars. The darker bar is going to be the don't like condition. The lighter bar is going to be the like condition. So what you're going to see here are the two mean treatment within polarization level. And so we basically see the same pattern across sort of everybody. People who are higher in affective polarization generally seem to agree more with the decision to unfriend. They're more supportive of breaking a relationship. But really, it all kind of looks fairly similar. You're always more supportive of the decision to unfriend when it's somebody you never liked. Okay. We see again, history of interaction matters, little support for unfriending. What if we've kind of stacked the deck? We sort of told people, oh, this is not a liked person, but relationships are much more organic than that, right? Like rarely do you meet somebody and you get like a stimulus saying, you're gonna hate this person. Like, wouldn't it be great if that was the case? It would save us some trouble. So we're going to run another study where we're going to try to somehow mimic the organicness of a relationship. We're going to follow Lewandowski, who basically does work suggesting that similarities aside from politics matter. And we're going to try to think about how relationships form over time. So thinking about the Minosi findings, that you learn a lot about how similar or different people are, and politics only comes later. So we're going to try to simulate meeting somebody, learning about their likes and dislikes, and only then learning kind of where politics fits into this. So this final study was done at the University of Arizona with students of the University of Arizona who were told about a potentially social network connection. All of these participants got a whole bunch of questions about tons of non-political favorites. Sports teams, TV shows, movies, food, a lot of stuff that, as my co-author Samara Clark said, undergraduate students really enjoy. And so then, only after that was there a random assignment. And the random assignment here was that they saw social media profiles. What's important here is that we didn't spell out for them like, this is a person who likes this show and they voted for this candidate and they like this movie and they like this food. The likes and dislikes were communicated via this kind of person's posts. So there were posts about TV shows they like, a post about their favorite food, a post about politics. And we randomly assigned participants across two factors. So basically, were you assigned to somebody who's compatible or non-compatible to you on these non-political things? Are you seeing somebody post about the TV shows that you also like, and the food that you also like, and the teams that you also like? Or are you seeing somebody post about things that you don't really like quite as much? And this was done by taking the answers they had given earlier. And for example, if you had said, we were doing it at the time when Schitt's Creek, everyone was watching Schitt's Creek. So if you had ranked Schitt's Creek as your #1 TV show and you were assigned to a compatible person, that person was posting about Schitt's Creek. If you had ranked, let's say, The Bachelor as your least favorite show and you're non-compatible, you're assigned to a person who's posting about The Bachelor. And then the second factor was, is this person going to also have a post about your in-party candidate, so same party as you, or is their political post going to suggest they support the other party? So essentially now you could be assigned to somebody who's just like you in every way, but they're from a different party, somebody who's just like you in every way from your party, somebody who is really different from you from your own party, and somebody who's just like you from your own party. Now, parties should matter, right? If we think about talking to somebody and seeing their posts, it's totally natural that we want to see the posts of somebody who agrees with us, right? Like it's no fun seeing the posts of somebody we hate. Well, maybe it is, but not in this particular case. But we're interested in how much that compatibility is going to matter, right? We don't expect that it's going to entirely crush the partisanship component, but we're curious about it. And so we're going to use 2 outcome measures. So how likely would you be to keep following this profile on social media? And then we had real $5 Starbucks gift cards. And so we showed people the Starbucks gift card code, right, that it was in fact real, and said, would you send this person the Starbucks gift card? Now, ultimately, because this was all manipulated, in the end, we debriefed them and they got the $5 gift card themselves. But in that moment, they really believed they could be sending a $5 gift card to another University of Arizona student whose profile this represented. So what happened in this particular case? So higher values here are going to mean that you are more likely to keep following the person. And this is what we get here. So essentially what we see here is that, of course, people are more likely to keep following somebody who is from their own party. But we do see that for the out party, compatibility does matter. Our kind of biggest difference in the study is that people aren't going to follow somebody who is not only from the out party, but is also incompatible. When we ask them about the Starbucks gift card, the results look like this. So again, we see here that generally the proportion of people who are going to send a Starbucks gift card is declines really in this case where you are incompatible and you're from the out party. So essentially the similarities also matter a bit here, kind of beyond just politics and partisanship. We didn't kind of pre-register any additional characteristics here, as we knew our sample size would be quite small for this study. So we're kind of just looking at means. Okay, so do people distinguish between compatibility, as the study suggests? Of course, partisanship matters, but we do see that people think differently about those with whom they're more similar. They're more likely to retain their relationships within this particular context. So where does all of this leave us? I think political unfriending is a really difficult to characterize phenomenon, in large part because a lot of the times when we see articles about it, these are kind of dramatic family fallouts, dramatic kind of things that end in friendship. But within the context of at least American, and I think British politics actually as well, most people are in kind of very similar social networks. They have never really unfriended anyone. They don't feel all that great about unfriending people as well. What we're trying to suggest is that the nature of the relationship is critical here. Politics is not always going to be primary, but in some cases, politics is basically the last straw of an ending of a really potentially terrible relationship. In some ways, politics kind of can highlight just how much you might hate this person, which is why it might act like this kind of last straw. But I think the question that is left here is politics unique? Are people actually ending relationships they don't love over all sorts of kind of unexpected differences and unexpected transgressions, right? If somebody, for example, started posting about, I don't know, a hobby that they really got into that you genuinely hated, and that's all what their social media posting was, you might unfriend them as well, but it probably wouldn't make the news. So essentially, the question that we're posting here is that, is the reason that politics looks like it's breaking relationship because the news has suggested to us that this is the case? And what is the chance that what is actually happening here is that these weren't great relationships to begin? And we're probably going to do another study to this end of whether politics is unique. So if anyone has any ideas, we'd be super happy to hear them. So I'm going to end here for now.
I keep thinking about some example that came up in the 2016 election about a couple that got divorced. You know, she voted for Trump and they ended up divorced. And I think like what you're saying resonates a lot. That they probably weren't a totally happy couple who suddenly one day she woke up and was like, "You voted for Trump, I don't know where you are." But I also come back to in like a 10-year relationship or a marriage, that was long term like theirs. It seems like it's probably not shock, right? Like you would know someone's politics for a long time ahead of that, and that sort of is, I guess I don't even know exactly what my question is, but grappling around, it's not like usually you just have no idea, and then one day they go, and maybe you don't, and maybe that's some of the thing too, that we avoid talking about politics to begin with, so maybe we aren't as aware of what people's beliefs are until some comment brings it out. I'm curious sort of what you think about that, of like the trajectory of then at that point something changes and how that happens. But also, to me, I think about these relationships and as it seems like we are seeing more evidence of people making choices based on politics. So with dating app data, things like that, people are more so than they used to advertising that and saying they wouldn't date someone from another party, sort of making those choices early on. But whether there is something about politics that's not just because you disagree with me, but that we've moralized it to a way that it might hold unique information, where it might be like, oh, if you believe those things, maybe you're not as good of a person as I thought. Like it holds more weight than it used to, than just like a hobby would, I guess. More so than historically.
Yeah, so historically it's going to be really hard, in large part because we weren't asking these questions. Surveys were not asking these questions quite as much until about 2016.
No.
So I read so many of these I got divorced over Donald Trump articles. What sort of stood out to me was that they didn't seem like great relationships, right? So in one case, somebody's talking about how they got divorced because of the election. And it's like, well, we got divorced over this election because I wanted to volunteer for this candidate and my husband refused to watch the kids by himself, which is like, is that politics, right? Or is that this other thing? So I think, again, because people construct histories, it's really hard to come up with these. I actually think certainly some people are getting divorced over politics. But I think the fact that these sources get selected for the media amplifies these voices potentially beyond where they're actually at in the public. The other question about is it the moralization that is important here? I actually do think the moralization is important, but I think it's moralization rather than politics. I could see, for example, something like clean eating or giving your kids, genetically modified foods or giving them consumers. Like I see somebody Yes, exactly. I could see somebody moralizing kind of these issues and leading to sort of the same problem. I think the question then becomes this tipping point. At what point is this relationship no longer sustainable? But to me, I guess it's not politics. It takes a while for this relationship to become unsustainable. It's not really everything was great and then somebody voted for the wrong candidate and you're basically done, as sometimes the sort of narrative suggests. Am I supposed to give a microphone or no?
Oh, yeah, we just had some issues with, so if you can speak up and if you're worried about it, I have a microphone.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you've reached out to social media companies or thought about if you could get actual data of what's going on before the break, what you would look at, and if you think there's enough clues to answer some of these questions. Of maybe you can tell that there's fights going on before, or maybe there's some kind of disrespect signals too, because sometimes when people get really fired up about politics, the way they're talking to other people is in a way that could be upsetting for things that have nothing to do with politics. So yeah, have you reached out, and what kind of data would you want to get it?
So social media companies definitely aren't going to give me data. Just in general, they're unlikely to give me data. Not me personally, but I think so. Speaking generally, yeah, I think that would be kind of a really, I think it would be a really interesting way to go. I think what would be interesting there, kind of looking at the data, is looking at fights, even generally as well, right? Political fights or fights over something else that break out and how they trickle over into people's relationships. So we could look at like hostile language, topic aside, and see if certain topics are more likely to produce an end of a relationship than others. I think in some sense, where we're at now with social media, it would still have questions of causal patterns in terms of who has basically retained these ties in terms of having the fights up to this point when you can, mute or block somebody. But I think basically checking out almost like a tipping point model of what is the language that has to happen for somebody to say, yes, we will unfriend there. We had thought about, in lieu of having access to social media data, of doing essentially a study that gives these kind of conditions and saying, do you say we're done here? Do you say we're done here? Do you say we're done here? Which I think could get at that tipping point condition, sort of suggest, which is a really good point.
And then doing it across different topics.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about conditioning on affect polarization in study 1 and study 2. I'm curious if you captured that as a partisan affect or social distance, and to what extent do you think social distance might be, I guess, more proximal to this sort of unfriending, and sort of on the same note, do you think conflict aversion might have a role to play here?
Yeah, so we've done it with both partisan affect and social distance. The results that I showed were on social distance, but we have the affect via thermometer measure as well. I think so. We just talked for about an hour about conflict aversion in the class. If I had to sort of speculate on conflict aversion here, I wonder about it in two ways. On the one hand, my initial instinct was to say, oh, I think people who are conflict averse or conflict avoidant would engage in this unfriending. They want to get themselves out of these situations. On the other hand, though, as a conflict avoidant person myself, it is terrifying to tell somebody that you're not going to be friends with them anymore. So I imagine, and I even imagine, like thinking about this, even just clicking the unfriend on social media, like you're thinking, I personally remember Googling, can somebody find out if I've been friends with them to that point. So I think it could either, I don't exactly know which way the prediction would go. Are people who are conflict avoidant more likely to stay in these relationships solely because they don't want to have conflict? Or are they immediately likely to pull back at the emergence? I think it's a really interesting empirical question.
So, like, after your talk, I'm like, pretty much convinced that like politics may not be the primary like, reason for unfriending, but at the same time, I'm like questioning like some of this like match between your question and the study design. And like as someone who like does experiments, I hate to ask questions about external validity, but
No, that's not important though.
but like I was wondering like what's your thoughts on like so your study 1 and study 2 were asking people to assess someone else's decision about unfriending. So like I'm curious like how likely would those patterns would replicate for like their own decisions to unfriend? Your study 3 was about friending rather than unfriending. So like my second question was like you mentioned that you're planning for another study, and like I'm curious like what other aspects you'll like address in your upcoming study.
Yeah, so those are great questions, and they're really super important. So in the first two, in terms of judging somebody else, my instinct, and this is based on some research that John Ryan did on parenting, is that how we evaluate other people that engage in behaviors is sort of a really important sense of our values. So certainly no, this doesn't answer the question of would you unfriend somebody over politics. But if the broader question here is, have we come to a political point where we believe that we should be ending relationships over politics, which is what the media are covering? I think the way that we evaluate others who have done this, especially after reading the context, speaks to that in kind of an important way, right? Because if everyone were to say, yes, you should unfriend somebody, that would suggest that in this part in our kind of society, in our political moment, we believe we should unfriend everyone solely because they voted for another person. Does that mean that you would do it? Maybe not, maybe yes, maybe no. But it suggests that you believe we are at a social point where that is an acceptable, correct, and appropriate thing to do, which I think is key here as well. On our third study, you're right, we can't simulate somebody being in a long thing, but in the context, we're telling them that they have followed this person. And so we're asking, would you keep following them or would you unfollow them to simulate that as well? Now, in theory, we could give people cases, right, and say, this is what's happening. Would you unfollow? I think that carries with it kind of considerable external and internal validity issues as well. I think it's sort of fairly costless, right? If I'm a really conflict averse person in an experiment, I'd be like, yeah, sure, I'd unfriend them. But in the real world, I might think, I might go down a rabbit hole of, will they know? Will I ever see them? How would they feel about it? What would I do? So in some sense, asking them about it directly creates potentially a really costless environment as well. So I think this is what makes the question in a way really, really thorny, in part because we can't see people doing it as it's happening. And that's kind of our workaround, is to basically say, do you think this is something that is okay, right? In that way, is this something in this political moment that's okay?
Your first part of your answer made me think, do you think if you ran this study and asked people not whether they think it's okay, but whether they think other people would think it's okay, that we have a misperception, perhaps due to the media, of what other people are doing? So if it was like, what would other people see this as appropriate action? Would they view it favorably? Do you have a hypothesis? And then I have a suggestion.
I think they would.
Okay.
My initial, if I had to, if you handed me a pre-registration right now, I would pre-register that they would think that the feeling would be, I don't think this is okay, but everyone else believes that this is going to be okay, that everyone else is going to think this is high disagreement on this sort of perceptions of how polarized everyone else are. So shout out to Gavin's work on perceptions there. So I think that though would get again at this broader social perspective. Again, not at whether they would do it, but at least what they think would happen to them potentially.
Thanks for the really great talk. What I'm left thinking is, I know you're not commenting on individual relationships. Like, it's not bad necessarily for me, because like these friends don't mean anything to me. But maybe in the sense of like, there's kind of a growing suggestion that to reduce polarization, we should talk to people who have different values so we can understand them. So then unfriending these people is like cutting off our chances and creating networks that are more like-minded. And so I guess I'm kind of asking you to maybe speculate, or maybe you have other work that speaks to like what that means for social networks more broadly, and the idea of like echo chambers.
Well, okay, so I think the first question is on talking to other people. I think the research is kind of murky on that. There's some research to suggest that having people talk to others maybe entrenches polarization, because they hear these other ideas and they're kind of thinking, oh, I was right all along. These people are as stupid as I thought, that sort of idea. On the other hand, there's some recent research. I think David Brookman has a paper that shows that actually having these interactions could decrease affective polarization, but it's very temporary. So for the day, affective polarization was lower, and then later it went back up. So could cutting off these conversations cut off that sort of thing? I think in most cases, people aren't unfriending somebody because they have thoroughly enjoyed hearing their point of view, and it was communicated in a way that was effective and reasonable. So I think in a lot of cases, these are sort of poor relationships. Could that have negative political consequences? So Jenny Wolak was here earlier when I talked about this with her. Jenny's response was, well, this is really bad because we should know how to put up with annoying people. And the fact that we can just unfriend them whenever they do something annoying, that's bad for our society. We should know how to put up with this annoying uncle who like won't stop talking about politics. That I think is an open normative question, right? How much we should put up with people who are profoundly annoying and with whom we have terrible relationships. And I think that's a question beyond just affective polarization and echo chambers.
I think this is really, really cool. I'm super excited that you're doing work in this. A question that I had while listening was, in my admittedly very limited work, because I'm still a student, I found like some evidence that people do tend to have much stronger emotional responses to people that they're really close to posting counter-attitudinal things about politics, right? Like your co-author probably wouldn't mind that much if Lobster Lady posted something, but like if my grandpa or a sibling posts something, that people are likely to have a stronger negative reaction. So I'm just wondering if you have any ideas about how to square that with this idea that, which I totally buy, that people are still more likely to maintain those relationships with close contacts.
So in our survey data, the CES data, we asked people about a bunch of contexts. And some of those and those were specifically about close family relationships. And those contexts were a variety of kind of the types of things that you're mentioning. So things like somebody actually gets really is mean to you on Facebook, your family member, and we clarified something you're very, very close to prior to this point. We ask about somebody kind of yelling at you at a family gathering. We ask about people posting misinformation or incorrect political facts and so forth. So we asked about these things that would engender like a lot of really strong emotional responses. And we get very few people saying that this has been their experience. Now, we do have one case where we have a bump in people saying, I've unfriended somebody because of that. And that is when we tell them a context of you got in a into a fight about a non-political but family matter, and that's when people tell us, yeah, this is when I've often unfriended somebody, when I've stopped talking to them as well. But I think you're absolutely right that there's something about somebody who you really super trust, and you trust to have this emotional component, posting something, especially if it's unexpected and inflammatory and angry, that might produce this sort of really, really, really negative reaction. I think that would be really interesting to test. Though it would be a tough test in the sense of we have to basically kind of simulate that emotional component in that case. But I think, but in the cases we gave people where we kind of fine grain asked them, we still didn't see much of those patterns.
So fantastic, Yanna. Thank you. I've got tons of notes, but I'll ask one question, which has to do with study 3 and the impression formation, which was really cool because obviously you started from like how we normally get to know people, right? And sort of that relationship building and impression formation. And one of the things that's interesting, at least in some of the work on impression formation on social media, is that politics is one of a very small number of things that people can gauge accurately about other people from their profiles. But that was worked on looking at Facebook and the old German equivalent of Facebook, where that is like a thing that you check off. Does it matter what platform? That when it comes to this sort of unfollowing versus unfriending, does the word like unfriend connote something bigger than unfollow? And I guess I'm asking in some ways about like features and the way that we make psychological sense of features.
Yeah, so most of the specific unfriending is a very Facebook phenomenon, Facebook research based. A lot of the survey data is actually very specifically asking about Facebook. On the argument, because specifically of these features, right? That it's sort of easy, it feels impersonal, and so forth. I think the other thing that often gets conflated here, again, due to the features of the platform, is unfriend versus mute. So essentially, you're retaining that relationship, but you're no longer hearing anything that the person is saying. Most of the survey questions ask about both. So we actually don't know somebody that has ended the relationship versus somebody who's just said like, I'm gonna mute you because I wanna maintain this relationship. So I don't wanna hear about all the stuff that you're posting. There's research to suggest that this kind of unfriending environment is more likely to happen on Facebook than Twitter, though Twitter might be totally different tomorrow. In part because Facebook seems like it should be a more friendly, like we're sharing baby pictures, we're sharing kind of family thing via Facebook. So these disagreements might seem more unpleasant in that particular case. And it's also less likely to happen somewhere like Instagram, where in theory, for a while, there was this idea of like positive vibes. We shouldn't really be talking about politics to begin with. So this is kind of how you maintain a relationship. But I think this question about platforms and how people are using the affordances of the platforms and how people are using the features is something that we don't entirely yet have a kind of nationally representative handle on, in large part because we're asking people about kind of somewhat different things, which is conflating muting and unfriending, thinking about, and this question of unfollow, which also I think really confuses people because they said I mute somebody, so I've unfollowed them, but I've also broken this relationship, so I've unfollowed them, or I've blocked them, so I've also unfollowed them, which is kind of a more extreme version here. So I do think it's something that we don't have particularly good handle on here.
I don't study this, my memory is bad, but I feel like I remember in 2016 on Facebook there being a tool like click here and you can find out who the political out party, which friends of yours support the out party so that you can unfriend them. And then subsequently, I remember a discussion like around that time period, you know, about unfriending and about this phenomenon. And I have no idea. Since unfriending is such a particular keyword, like, is it even possible? Could you do like a qualitative study about discussions of unfriending? Is that possible to do? And would you want to do it?
So I'll admit I'm not on Facebook. So I'm not, but this idea that there could be some sort of add-on to Facebook that would tell you somebody of the opposing party so you can unfriend them seems very, very much plausible within something that would happen on the platform. I think this idea of unfriend somebody who is in the opposing party becomes really prominent in 2016. So that makes sense, right? Because a lot of the news becomes about people basically saying, oh, I'm going to unfriend everybody who has voted for or somebody else and so forth. Could we do a qualitative study? So I think qualitative research, yes, like we certainly could. It would be interesting for us. You know, I think it's something like that has to be done really, really well. So we'd want to have a bit more training as qualitative scholars before we undertook extensive interview with people, because that is sort of another really particular skill that we would want to have a good handle on before we just kind of talk to people and ask questions. But I think that would be a really important component there as well.
I'm curious about what you think about the role of politics in these types of discussions in relationships with less relational mobility. So like unfollowing is very easy, but how do you think that it affects relationships that we don't end or can't end? And is there like degradation of relationships that, you know, you've retained, but rather than feeling sort of middle of the line, right? Like this person is okay. Oh, they posted something that I don't like. Well, just get rid of them because I only kind of tolerated them before, they're fine. But what about those relationships that you have extremely negative and extremely positive, like ambivalent feelings toward, that you retain the relationship, but you also have some very negative interactions that perhaps you would not have had were it not for politics?
So is it a relationship that you feel like you have to retain for that kind of thing?
Yeah, I'm interested in those types of relationships or in relationships that you want to retain, like close family relationships, for example, right? That then become sort of, it's either like, you know, heaven or hell in these relationships, you know, depending on whether politics comes up.
Yeah, my speculation here would be that it would have to be a mutual agreement that we're not going to talk about politics. So in order, where somebody actually has to make a conscious effort, I'm going to retain this relationship, and I'm going to do it by never speaking about politics again. Now, what would happen if the other person basically does not honor that in any capacity? I think that's tough. To me, that's the type of family relationships that in some sense is the hardest to study, because it's so particular. It's usually somebody very, very close to you, and it's somebody that you feel the need to retain that connection with. My sense, again, speculatively, is that it would again come down to why you believe you're trying to retain it. Are you trying to retain it because it's socially appropriate to retain it, like if it's a parent or something like that? Are you trying to retain it because it is an emotionally satisfying relationship heretofore, right? And so it's something that you want to keep doing, it's something that you want to keep trying. It's hard because my sense that would be a small proportion of all of these unfriendings that are happening. The bulk are probably friendships, or especially kind of these peripheral friendships, like Seafood Lady. So I think that would be a really interesting case and a really interesting question. So what should we do with the relationships that we feel like we have to maintain that get really bad? My sense is just pure disengagement, essentially. Pure lack of communication.
Just note that Amazon sells t-shirts that say allergic to politics. I mean, as somebody who wears it to their family events now.
Do people actually not talk to them about politics?
Or, I don't know.
Okay.
Probably will do it more.
But or more, right? They wanna, but it made, your question made me wonder if sometimes, like, if that tension and that conversation that is not back to, like, about the politics, but about, like, it brings up disrespect or miscommunication or things that are frustrating, not because you disagree, but because how you disagree is so sort of problematic, right? It's like I don't feel understood, like we're not having a nice conversation. It's not really the politics, it's
right. So if somebody basically, if you're trying to desperately to maintain a relationship, you say, let's not talk about politics, and the person sort of deliberately talks about politics, that's a sign of like a complete disregard for somebody else's preferences within a relationship. There's this, I think the New York Times, there's a story about this woman who claims she was friends with somebody for 40 years. And then after Trump gets elected, this person starts sending her cards of Trump because this person believes it will hurt her. You're kind of like, this is a friend. You know, this has been your friend for 40 years that's engaging in this type of behavior. It's kind of a sign of something fairly detrimental.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the use of the word politics, because it seems like 2016, it's kind of the center of all of this, is the start, and it's hard to really think about politics. What's the problem? Everything that you've set aside about ties and strengths of relationships, it seems like the things that made people the angriest about that election were racism and sexism. And so how did you put the more granularity in politics, and how did you decide to ask how did you decide to define politics the way you did in your studies? How would you redefine it next time if you wanted to look at more subtleties of what it is about? Is it politics or is it thinking other?
So I think, the definition of what is politics is something that is inherently really broad, in large part because people have impressions of what politics is in their heads that is going to be different across individuals, right? For some people, it's going to be conflict. For others, it's going to be policy. So we began with sort of the most basic idea of voting for another person, because looking across the media coverage, that was the beginning point. It's sort of articles saying, so-and-so voted for another person. And so, like, I've unfriended them, and so forth. That seemed, sort of almost too simplistic in a way, and sort of stacking the deck kind of in favor of the personal winning out because of the vote. Because you're right, there are all these things that are inherent in politics. So this is why we tried to go for a more kind of potentially inflammatory statement in the other thing. But I think to the extent that people, we don't use the word politics in any of our treatments. We basically give actions. We say somebody posted this thing or somebody made this statement. And I think what sort of makes this research difficult is that there are different things that come to mind as people read these statements, right? For some people, voting for a certain candidate is going to be read as kind of supporting racism and sexism. The party statement is this party is destroying America is going to be read as a much broader political cultural statement. And to us, kind of this idea of what people bring into these contexts without even using the word politics is more reflective to go to the question of external validity, so reflective of how they view the world. I think if we were spelling it out beyond that, I think could be interesting to see how inflammatory things would have to be, what this person would have to do, could potentially get to this idea of at what point people 100% support unfriending. But what is interesting about political context is in fact how much what impressions people form of them, what they assume about the external components of what it means to vote for a certain candidate or post a certain view. And so to us, giving people a context and seeing do they think this context is relationship breaking, speaks to this other perceptions of what we think it is to vote for another party or support a candidate or essentially be a political person. So I think to get at this idea of why they support or don't support and what it's implying would be an open-ended question at the end, which I think we should probably ask about what they think that implies. Yeah.
Yeah, and here goes just a quick follow-up. Did you look at any heterogeneity with like race and gender to see if there's any stronger signal there?
Yes, so in our survey data, we looked at demographic characteristics that leave you more likely to unfriend, and it's white men are most likely to unfriend.
Doesn't really support racism or sexism.
Huh?
That doesn't really support racism or sexism, I guess, if it, yeah, because you would think it would maybe be someone who is most likely to be hurt by, right, not the dominant.
So that was actually our prediction too. We were trying to see like, are these ending relationships people who are kind of in marginalized or precarious positions, getting themselves out of contexts that are very bad and traumatic for them? And so we reran the results repeatedly because we were so surprised that it was in fact white men who were most likely to engage in ending these relationships. Yeah. What?
I said, maybe everybody else is used to it.
Sort of, I guess, another external validity question. In the real world, how much of unfriending do you think is about incompatibility, which I think is the argument that's advanced here, based on partisanship and other factors, versus expectancy violation? Because the three studies you presented here, 1 and 2 are like moderate to strong ties. They're 10-year friendships that know each other well enough to interact in person. They're probably not just like randos who have each other added on Facebook. They're not secretive. And in study 3, they're meeting someone new, and there's not really a form of expectancy yet.
Yeah.
But my impression of listening to you talk and anecdotally is that a lot of these unfriends are with weak ties you added 3 years ago, and you've never seen their post, and suddenly something crops up on Facebook. They said something political, and it may or may not be, out partisan. So that is not necessarily about incompatibility as much as you maybe implicitly assume that they share your partisanship, and the moment they say otherwise, you're like, oh, actually, this person sucks. Oh, I want to unfriend them. And maybe that's still compatibility, but it's an expectancy framework as well. I'm curious how you think that balances and how it interacts with tie strength.
Yes, I definitely think there is an expectancy. If we go to Jamie Settle's work, part of the argument about Facebook as a role in polarization is that we're exposed suddenly to these people who are very, very tangential, like we made them 3 years ago at a wedding. And suddenly we see their political post, and that's not the context we met them in, that's not what we thought of them, and so we're sure shocked and we unfriend them, and we hate that we had that experience in some sense. How much of this is expectancy? It's one of those things that so could you ever be totally surprised that somebody you knew for 10 years behaved in a certain way or voted a certain way? In a lot of the media narratives, people seem genuinely shocked that somebody they had known for decades voted for a person of the other party or had a sort of sense or something like that. I think what is, again, speculating, possibly most likely to happen is that it's potentially over time strengthening of a political perception, over time getting into a particular political candidate. And so it looks really sudden to your tie, but to you it's just something that has been happening. So in that sense, you can have it both be something that's been part of the person for a while and be a total expectancy violation for the person who's seeing it for the first time. So the question I think purely would be, would this be less shocking if you saw it develop over time? I think that'd be an interesting empirical question. So it doesn't seem quite as jarring when it finally comes.
Yeah, it's like the weight of any individual point of compatibility depends on how.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh,
Sorry.
My question has not since changed. But I guess I'm interested, because I've kind of forgot actually that study 3, my original question was like, you looked at relationship maintenance, but have you looked at thought about relationship formation and how compatibility affects it? And then like after your comment, I realized that's kind of what study 3 was doing. And I was thinking, I guess in study 3, going off of study 3, other ways to simulate meeting someone or to conceptualize compatibility. So maybe thinking about other methods, like potentially you could do like an in-lab study, and this wouldn't be compatibility in the sense conceptualizing it as likes and similar or dissimilar, but compatibility just in terms of liking someone or feeling more like intimacy with someone or like a rapport with someone. So for example, like a full in-lab study where you do it's like a self-disclosure paradigm, like fast friends, for example, in one group versus not. So then one group feels potentially maybe more close with their partner, with their interaction partner. And then maybe, so like this, either it would be just like all like non-Confederates, all just like participants, and that you just have people from different parties or similar parties, or it would be like a Confederate who's like told, who still is like participates in it naturally, but then it's told to disclose a particular like partisanship. I was just trying to think about other ways in which you can simulate meeting someone or conceptualize compatibility, because it doesn't necessarily have to be similar versus dissimilar.
Yeah, so our original study 3 was actually going to be an in-lab where we would
Okay.
bring people in and have them chat and kind of form these relationships in an in-person environment. And then we got COVID. And so all of our scheduled labs basically couldn't happen anymore. We tried to move it to Zoom, but nobody showed up to Zoom. And so we essentially like pivoted, filed a brand new pre-registration so as not to waste the Starbucks gift cards that we had purchased. So that is how we ended up with all the Starbucks gift cards that Starbucks would not refund, but very kindly converted them to online codes for us. And by kindly, we hand entered all 400 Starbucks gift card codes, and they then made them electronic. So that was initially the goal, is to bring people into the lab and talk it through, because there's some evidence that might be the case. So Matt Lewandowski's forthcoming book, for example, is pre-COVID. So if he brings people into an in-person environment and they talk things through, and only then they get to politics. And so people are more likely to be open to others and so forth. But I think like now that potentially could do in-person studies, we should revisit this idea. Maybe be hopeful and buy new Starbucks gift cards in hopes that that wasn't the causal factor in the pandemic.
Yeah. My one other follow-up is like I was wondering whether people's memories of their interaction would shift once they have like that knowledge of their political party comes at the end. Maybe they have like questionnaires throughout and they're like, I like this person, this interaction is going well, like all these like questions, and then it shifts once they're once they like have that revealed information. I then wonder like how they would look back on that conversation in general. Like would they forget about the initial times when they felt rapport and connection and like that person, and like that new information has clouded the entire conversation, or would they have accurate memory of their feelings?
Oh man, I love that so much. That'd be such a great test. Yeah, that'd be super interesting.
All right, we've hit apparently past 5 o'clock, so
Thank you so much. This was so great.
Thank you for coming.